Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The Indian Meteorological Department has predicted that Cyclone Umphan, which has formed in the Bay of Bengal, has developed into a super cyclone and it is expected to make landfall tomorrow along the coastline of West Bengal and Bangladesh. A super cyclone can generate extremely high speed winds in the range of 240 km per hour, and it can cause extensive damage to both life and property. So this article provides us an opportunity to understand a few important things about cyclones. First, let us talk about the cyclone season in the Bay of Bengal. See, the formation of cyclones in the Bay of Bengal can be seen in two seasons. One, in the pre-monsoon season, that is between April to June, and two, in the post-monsoon season, that is between October to December. According to historical data, a majority of these cyclones are formed between October and December. Whereas in the pre-monsoon season, we witness the formation of few cyclones in the month of May and very few cyclones are formed in the month of April. But generally, the cyclones that form in the month of April and May are known to be very destructive. Now let us talk about the naming system for cyclones. See, the World Meteorological Organization has developed a region-specific naming system for tropical storms. Based on these guidelines of the WMO, the countries of the North Indian Ocean have evolved a naming system for tropical cyclones that occur in the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, which are a part of the North Indian Ocean. There are 8 countries from the North Indian Ocean region which are a part of this naming system. This includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Maldives and Oman. As per the guidelines of the WMO, these 8 countries have suggested 8 names each. So in total, we have 64 names that are used in a sequential order to name the tropical cyclones that form in the North Indian Ocean region. So the name Umphan that has been used to name this cyclone was suggested by Thailand. Now let us understand what is landfall. See, landfall refers to an event when a storm that is formed over water crosses over to land. It basically refers to the time and place where the eye of the storm crosses over to the land. So when you have a tropical cyclone that has formed over water, and when its central part, that is the eye, which is referred to as a region of calm, when it crosses over to land, the time and place of its landing is referred to as the landfall event. So when a storm or a tropical cyclone makes landfall, it generates extreme weather conditions which can cause widespread damage. In the case of Cyclone Umphan, which has been categorized as a super cyclone, the landfall event is expected to cause extensive damage along the coastlines of West Bengal, Bangladesh, and as well as in the coastal parts of Odisha. During landfall, a cyclone brings extremely heavy rainfall to the coastal areas, and it can generate very high speed winds which can lead to storm surges, and these extreme weather conditions can cause extensive damage to both life and as well as property. In case of cyclones that have been categorized as super cyclones, wind speeds can be in the range of 240 km per hour, and it can cause extensive damage to life and property that is located along the coastal areas. If a cyclone has been categorized as an extremely severe cyclonic storm, then wind speeds can be in the range of 165 to 175 km per hour with gusting speeds of up to 195 km per hour. These high-speed winds, accompanied with heavy rainfall and storm surges, can cause extensive damage to life and property, including the uprooting of trees, damage to kacha houses, old pakka buildings, and as well as to infrastructure, especially to critical infrastructure located along the coastal areas. Apart from injuring and killing a number of people, these cyclones can cause extensive damage to infrastructure, such as the uprooting of electric poles and telephone poles, damage to power cables and power grids, extensive damage to connectivity infrastructure such as roadways, railway lines, etc. So such damage to infrastructure can lead to a complete disruption of connectivity and communication in the region. Apart from this, tropical cyclones, especially the ones that have been categorized as super cyclones, they can cause extensive damage to standing crops, they can affect the livelihood of fishermen, and they can even damage biodiversity in the region. So in order to deal with this disaster, the National Disaster Management Authority has come out with a cyclone-specific policy and guidelines for disaster management. As per this policy, highest priority has been given to prevention and mitigation measures as a part of the pre-disaster phase. Accordingly, in the pre-disaster phase, the Indian Meteorological Department has been designated as the nodal agency for providing early warning and forecasting services. With improved early warning and forecasting services, timely alerts can be issued and appropriate prevention and mitigation strategies can be implemented. As per these guidelines of the NDMA, the best mitigation strategy for minimizing loss of lives is to build adequate cyclone shelters and put in place efficient and effective evacuation plans. As soon as early warnings are received from the IMD, the district authorities are responsible for implementing these evacuation plans with the support of the state and the central authorities. As per these evacuation plans, the district administration would be responsible for halting all activities in the coastal district, including fishing, and it has to work with the specialized forces of the NDRF and the SDRF, and it has to evacuate the coastal population, especially the vulnerable population, into these cyclone shelters. So as per these established disaster management plans, the specialized units of the NDRF and the SDRF have already been deployed in West Bengal and as well as in coastal Odisha. So in the coastal districts of these states, the district administration has to simultaneously deal with the triple challenge posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the crisis created by the reverse migration of the migrant workers, and the expected landfall of super cyclone Umphan. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6 and an article from page number 15, which evaluates the economic stimulus package that was announced by the government under the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. See, the Prime Minister had claimed that the economic stimulus package amounts to nearly 20 lakh crore rupees, accounting for nearly 10% of India's GDP. But contrary to these claims, economists and industry experts believe that the actual fiscal impact of this package would be just around 2 to 3% of the GDP, and the actual increase in fiscal expenditure for the government would be just around 0.8% to 1.2% of the GDP. This is because the key pillar of this economic relief package is a set of liquidity measures, the provision of easier loans, and a repackaging of existing schemes and provisions. As we have discussed over the last 1 week, under the relief package, the government has announced a set of liquidity measures, which includes the provision of cheaper and easier loans, especially for the MSME sector, for farmers, etc. It has also announced a set of repackaged schemes and policies, and more importantly, it has introduced a set of key reforms to various industries. So the actual outflow of money for the government, that is the actual increase in fiscal expenditure, would be very low because a large part of it is comprised of loans and repackaged schemes and policies. But however, some of these measures have been designed to introduce a wider set of economic reforms spread over various industries in order to introduce a supply side push to generate growth in the medium to long term. But the editorial and several economists believe that the government has made use of the pandemic as an opportunity to introduce several politically sensitive reforms, such as the opening up of key sectors, including defense, coal mining, space, etc., for greater FDI and privatization. These reforms, including the provision of cheaper and easier loans for the MSME sector, are definitely appreciable as they try to introduce a supply side push in order to generate growth in the medium to long term. But the problem is that these measures do not bring any immediate relief to the weaker and vulnerable sections that are currently suffering as a result of the lockdown. While the editorial appreciates these reforms, including the additional allocation made to schemes such as Manrega, it does remind the government that it should have considered providing immediate relief to the weaker sections and to the sections of the economy that have been most affected by the lockdown by providing for direct cash transfers and tax cuts. Because such a policy, accompanied with these medium to long-term reforms, would have helped in introducing a demand-side push as well by increasing purchasing power and consumption. The reason why the government has chosen to focus more on medium to long-term reforms instead of providing for immediate relief could be because it might be planning to reserve its firepower for a future date, as the pandemic is expected to last for many more months or maybe for many more years to come. So this is definitely a gamble that the government has taken, and only time will tell whether this strategy would succeed or would it end up creating a newer and a bigger problem for the government. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6. Over the last couple of months, a number of cases have emerged around the country wherein journalists have been arrested by state police on the charges that they were spreading fake news related to the COVID-19 pandemic. There was an incident in Gujarat where a reporter was reporting on the political developments in the state. He had reported that Gujarat's chief minister might be replaced for his inept handling of the pandemic. Then in another case in Andaman and Nicobar, a reporter had written about the unscientific quarantine methods that were being followed by the local administration. In this case as well, the reporter was arrested by the local police under criminal laws. Then in another incident in Tamil Nadu, a reporter in Coimbatore had written about alleged corruption in the distribution of food packets during the lockdown. For this article as well, the writer was arrested under criminal laws. Then in another case in Delhi, a reporter who wrote about the communalization of the pandemic was also arrested and charged under criminal laws. See, Section 54 of the Disaster Management Act declares the spreading of rumors and fake news during a disaster as a criminal offence, and it empowers the police to penalize the act of panic spreading during a disaster by charging the accused under relevant provisions of the criminal law. See, such a provision is definitely essential in order to help curb the spread of fake news and rumors, especially during times of a disaster. Because spreading rumors and fake news during a disaster could result in the spread of panic, it could result in violence, and it could disturb peace and stability in the society. But in these cases, it has been observed that journalists who were writing about political developments, corruption, etc. during the pandemic, they have been charged under sedition law by misusing Section 54 of the Disaster Management Act. See, sedition under the Indian Penal Code refers to anti-national activities. That is, activities which could threaten the integrity and sovereignty of the country. But prima facie, it is very clear that these incidents did not involve any anti-national or seditious activities, and hence the editorial says that this is a clear attempt to misuse criminal laws in order to intimidate journalists. According to the editorial, the real intention behind these arrests could be to prevent journalists from reporting on controversial political developments and acts of corruption. The editorial says that Section 54 of the Disaster Management Act and the Sedition Law have been misused in these incidents in order to intimidate journalists by using the pandemic as an excuse, and this represents a direct assault on the freedom of expression and the freedom of press. So the editorial argues that fighting fake news by using sedition law creates an opportunity for misusing these criminal laws in order to intimidate journalists and suppress their reporting on any inconvenient political developments and acts of corruption. Now let's take up a column from page number 6 in which the writer evaluates the performance of the higher judiciary during the pandemic. See, the higher judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, is seen as the protector and enforcer of rights. But of late, the Supreme Court has created an impression that it has failed to protect the rights of migrant workers during the pandemic and the lockdown. See, over the last few weeks, a number of public interest litigations were filed at the Supreme Court, which were asking it to issue directions to the government in order to act in time and protect the rights of migrant workers. But in most of the cases, the Supreme Court even refused to hear the petitioners entirely, and it said that the current migrant crisis cannot be prevented, and there is nothing much that the court and the government can do to prevent migrant workers from walking back to their native places. So in most of these cases, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, and it created an impression that the Supreme Court is not really concerned about the rights and the well-being of the migrant workers, and this has dented the image of the institution as the protector and enforcer of rights. According to the writer, there are two reasons why this impression is being created. One, the Supreme Court has genuinely failed to act in time, and it has failed to uphold and protect the rights of migrant workers. And two, the Supreme Court has been misled to pass inaccurate judgments due to the emergence of miscommunication in virtual courts. The writer says that in a regular physical court, there is an opportunity for the judges to interact directly with the lawyers, and hence there is very minimal scope for miscommunication and misunderstanding. But now that hearings are being held virtually in virtual courts, the scope for miscommunication and misunderstanding has increased, and upon this, the failure of the Supreme Court to provide adequate opportunities to the petitioners has resulted in these judgments where it appears that the Supreme Court has failed the migrant workers and it has failed to protect their rights. See, public interest litigations or PILs have emerged as a very important judicial and legal tool, and they have been often referred to as social action litigation. The emergence of PILs have helped the citizens and social activists to hold the government accountable by using the higher judiciary to protect and enforce their rights by issuing appropriate directions to the government. Over the years, the proactiveness of the Supreme Court in championing PILs has led to the emergence of both judicial activism and judicial overreach. In a number of cases, the Supreme Court has played its role as the protector and enforcer of rights through judicial activism, wherein the Supreme Court has curbed the powers of the executive, that is the government, and it has issued specific directions to the government in order to uphold the rights of the citizens. For example, if you look at the Vishaka case, it led to the Vishaka judgment through which the Supreme Court laid down the guidelines for prevention of sexual harassment at workplace. In such cases, the Supreme Court was clearly stepping into the domain of the executive, and the judiciary was seen to be playing the role of an activist in order to protect and enforce rights in the larger interests of the public and the society. But in a number of cases, there has been judicial overreach as well, where the Supreme Court has overstepped its mandate and entered the domain of the executive. For example, in the 2G case, the Supreme Court had issued guidelines as to how the auction of telecom spectrum has to be conducted by the government. A similar overreach of the judiciary was seen in the Aadhaar case as well. In such cases, legal experts and constitutional experts have pointed out that this amounts to judicial overreach, wherein the judiciary has overstepped its mandate and entered the domain of the executive. But either ways, PILs had emerged as an important tool through which citizens and activists could hold the government accountable because of their faith in the judiciary of being the protector and enforcer of rights. But with regard to the migrant crisis that has been caused by the lockdown, it appears that the Supreme Court has completely given up its role as the protector and enforcer of rights, and by failing to act on these PILs, it has given rise to an impression that it has failed in its constitutional duty. But the writer praises the High Courts for fulfilling their duty as the protector and enforcer of rights in cases related to the pandemic and the migrant crisis. For example, if you look at the High Court of Madras and the High Court of Andhra Pradesh, they have passed important judgments based on public interest litigations in order to uphold the rights of laborers and migrant workers. The writer says that this is in complete contrast to what the Supreme Court has done. This also helps us understand that in our constitutional scheme of things, High Courts are treated on par with the Supreme Court as far as the enforcement of fundamental rights are concerned. Because according to the Indian Constitution, both the Supreme Court and as well as the High Courts, they enjoy original jurisdiction as far as protection of fundamental rights are concerned. That is, a citizen can directly approach either the High Court or the Supreme Court if his fundamental rights have been violated by the state. But the writer is concerned about the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court as far as the enforcement of fundamental rights is concerned. That is, the Supreme Court enjoys appellate jurisdiction over the original jurisdiction of the High Courts as far as enforcement of fundamental rights are concerned. So with regard to judgments passed by the High Court, the Supreme Court enjoys appellate jurisdiction and it has the authority to overrule them. So the writer hopes that the rightful decisions taken by the High Courts of Madras and Andhra Pradesh should not be overruled by the Supreme Court by using its appellate jurisdiction. The writer stresses upon the point that it is not healthy for an institution such as the Supreme Court to give up its responsibility during this time of crisis, despite being seen as the protector and enforcer of rights. Now let's take up another column from page number 6, which evaluates the proposed amendments to the Electricity Act of 2003. See, when the Finance Minister announced the economic stimulus package, she proposed a set of reforms to the power tariff policy by introducing amendments to the Electricity Act of 2003. The writers of this column argue that if these proposed amendments are implemented, it will end up threatening India's national energy security and it will erode the concurrent status that has been accorded to electricity in the Indian Constitution. See, since electricity is a basic need, it has been placed under the concurrent list of the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution and provides for a shared jurisdiction between the centre and the states. According to the writers, if these amendments are implemented, it would weaken the control of state governments over electricity and it would erode the concurrent status of electricity. The writers are also of the opinion that if these amendments are implemented, it will increase the control of the center over electricity distribution, and this could further increase the burden of distribution companies or DISCOMs. See, over the last 2 decades, centralization has increased in the electricity sector. And as a result of this increased centralization, the cost of power has gone up, and this increased cost is being borne by the consumers and as well as by the distribution companies. To understand how the cost of power has gone up for the consumer and the distribution company due to increasing centralization, we need to look at the 2-tariff policy that was introduced by the Ministry of Power in the 1990s on the recommendations of the World Bank. See, this 2-tariff policy allowed for greater entry of private players in the field of power distribution, and it mandated the distribution companies to sign a long-term power purchase agreement or PPA, which obligated the distribution companies to pay a fixed cost to the power generator, irrespective of whether that power is consumed by the state or not, and irrespective of the fact whether the fuel prices have increased or decreased. So this contractual obligation to purchase power at a fixed cost has significantly increased the cost for the distribution companies, and naturally this increased cost has been transferred to the consumer by the DISCOMs. To understand how these long-term power purchase agreements increase the burden for DISCOMs, we need to look at the power consumption projections that were estimated by the Central Electricity Authority. See, the Central Electricity Authority in its electric power survey had overestimated peak electricity demand for 2019-20 by 70 gigawatts. This overestimation of electricity demand had led distribution companies to sign more long-term PPAs, and hence they have been forced to pay a fixed cost to the power generator even though there is no such demand for electricity. So this demand overestimate by the Central Electricity Authority has increased the burden on the DISCOMs. Then the third factor which has increased the burden on distribution companies is the policy of the Government of India with regard to renewable energy. See, in order to bring down India's emissions and increase electricity generation through renewable forms such as solar and wind power, the center has offered a number of incentives for the producers of renewable energy, and this includes the mandatory procurement of renewable energy by the DISCOMs. So this mandatory procurement of renewable energy, even though there is a lack of demand, and the obligation to pay a fixed cost as a result of these long-term power purchase agreements, the financial burden on distribution companies have increased significantly, leading to the dilution of state's role as far as electricity is concerned. Upon these existing problems, the Finance Minister has proposed a set of amendments to the Electricity Act of 2003, which further magnifies the problems for distribution companies and erodes the role of state governments as far as electricity is concerned. Through these amendments, the centre has proposed to introduce sub-franchisees to purchase and distribute power. Most likely, these sub-franchisees are likely to be given to private enterprises, and as of now, it is not clear whether these sub-franchisees will have to purchase power from the distribution companies or directly from the power producers. If these private sub-franchisees are allowed to purchase power directly from the producers, then it creates a huge disadvantage for DISCOMs because they have been obligated to pay a fixed cost under the long-term PPAs, whereas no such obligation would be there on these private sub-franchisees. Next, through these amendments, the centre has proposed to provide greater incentives and concessions for renewable energy, and this again is likely to increase the burden on DISCOMs. Third, the centre has proposed to eliminate all cross subsidies that are provided to electricity, and this is likely to increase the cost for the consumer. If all the cross subsidies are removed, then the state governments would be under greater pressure to subsidize the electricity cost, and this would not only affect the financial situation of the state governments but also that of the DISCOMs. Upon this, the centre has proposed that the state electricity regulators would be henceforth appointed by a central selection committee, which directly leads to greater centralization in the electricity sector. It has also been proposed to establish a central electricity contract enforcement authority, which would also be appointed by the same central selection committee, and this would take away the decision-making powers of the State Electricity Regulatory Commission. So the appointment of state regulators by the centre and the establishment of an electricity contract enforcement authority at the central level dilutes the powers of the State Electricity Regulatory Commission, and this erodes the concurrent status of electricity in the constitution. So these amendments basically dilute the control of the state governments and they increase the burden for discoms. Hence, the writers argue that increasing centralization threatens India's national energy security. Now let's take up an article from page number 10. The World Health Organization is dealing with a resolution that is calling for an independent, impartial global investigation to trace the origin of COVID-19. This resolution, which was initiated by Australia and few countries of the European Union, has been backed by the United States, and recently even India decided to support this resolution. Now the African countries have also decided to back the resolution, giving a big boost to the call for an independent investigation to study and trace the origins of COVID-19. The resolution proposes to study the source of this zoonotic disease, to evaluate the various food and animal routes through which the virus could have entered human beings, and to study the chain of transmission between the original source, the role of hosts, carriers or vectors, and how the virus made the final jump to human beings. This resolution, which is gaining more support at the World Health Organization, also represents the diplomatic standoff between the Western countries led by the United States and China. Over the last couple of months, United States, Australia, and a few other European countries have directly blamed China and held China to be responsible for the pandemic. China has fought against these allegations, and this has led to a diplomatic standoff between the two global superpowers. So the course of this proposed investigation and the stand that India would be taking as the current chair of the World Health Assembly is going to have a significant impact on global geopolitics. Next, on page number 14, we have an article which analyzes whether a new Cold War has emerged between the United States and China. But we have been repeatedly having this discussion over the last 1 month. So instead of discussing this article, I would request you to go through this once. Now let's move on to the practice questions for the day. Which of the following statements are correct? LCA Tejas is a single-engine, multi-role fighter aircraft designed and developed indigenously by the Indian Air Force. Its first squadron is being raised at the Sulur Air Base in Tamil Nadu. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, LCA Tejas, or the Light Combat Aircraft, has been indigenously developed by the Aeronautical Development Agency of the DRDO and HAL, or the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Astra missile developed by the DRDO is a beyond visual range air-to-air missile. Option C is the right answer. These two questions were asked because we have a related article on page number 1. According to this article, the Chief of the Indian Air Force has said that the formation of the second LCA squadron at the Sulur Air Base near Coimbatore would be completed by next week. The Air Force Chief has stressed on the efforts of the Indian Air Force to shift towards indigenous production as much as possible, and he has said that the Air Force is giving a very high priority for procuring 83 LCA Mk1A jets, which is an advanced variant of the LCA, and this deal is expected to be signed in another 3 months. The article also refers to the procurement of 200 indigenously developed Astra BVRM missiles by the Indian Air Force. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Saharia tribe is mainly found in Madhya Pradesh. They are expert woodsmen and forest produce gatherers. They have been listed as a particularly vulnerable tribal group, or PVTG. All the 3 statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. See, the Saharia tribe is mainly found in Madhya Pradesh and as well as in few parts of Rajasthan. This tribe has been listed as a PVTG and they are expert woodsmen, and their livelihood is primarily dependent on the collection of minor forest produce. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 4, the livelihood of the Saharia tribe and as well as matchmaking and marriage has been affected as a result of the lockdown. Since the lockdown has affected their mobility, it has restricted their collection of minor forest produce, and hence it is having an impact on their livelihood. The lockdown has also affected matchmaking and marriage because members of the Saharia tribe, they do not marry within the group. It means that they do not practice endogamy. They always look outside their community for marriages, and the lockdown has hence affected matchmaking and marriages. See, the topic of particularly vulnerable tribal groups is very important for your prelims and as well as for your mains. And in fact, the UPSC has already asked a prelims question on this topic. So kindly note down and go through these key points related to PVTGs. Now let's move on to the next question. Under the Forest Rights Act of 2006, which institution has the authority to decide upon various rights accorded under the Act? The correct answer is option B, the Gram Sabha. See, under the Forest Rights Act, various rights have been recognized for the tribal communities, which includes land rights, usage rights, community rights, etc. And the powers to decide upon these rights have been largely vested with the Gram Sabha. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Goldman Environmental Prize, also known as the Green Nobel, is a prize awarded annually to grassroots environmental activists, one from each of the world's 6 geographic regions. The second statement says, no Indian has ever been awarded with this prize. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect, so option A is the right answer. The Green Nobel has been won by several Indians, including the likes of Medha Patkar, Prafulla Samantara, etc. These two questions were asked because according to this article on page number 4, forest biodiversity and tribal rights are being violated and destroyed in the Kandhamal district of Odisha. Green Nobel Prize winner Prafulla Samantara has alleged that forest rights are being diluted and the legal rights accorded to the Gram Sabha under the Forest Rights Act has been eroded in an unconstitutional manner, and this has resulted in the destruction of forest biodiversity in the region. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? USAID is a global NGO that funds UN development projects around the world. It is primarily responsible for administering civilian foreign aid during disasters and socio-economic developmental assistance. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, USAID is not a global NGO. It is an independent funding agency and development agency that is under the US government. The primary responsibility of USAID is to administer and distribute civilian foreign aid and developmental assistance based on the directions of the US President, the US Secretary of State, and the US National Security Council. The funds of USAID are distributed in such a manner which would help the United States to further its geopolitical interests. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, USAID is donating 200 ventilators to India in order to help the Indian government to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now let's take up the next practice question. Pinanga andamanensis, which was recently in news, is a critically endangered palm species that is endemic to the South Andaman. Option A is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 16, the Pinanga andamanensis is a rare endemic palm species that has been listed as critically endangered, and it can be found only at the Mount Harriet National Park located in the South Andaman Island. Earlier, this species was thought to be extinct, but later a few specimens have been encountered at the Mount Harriet National Park in South Andaman. To further conserve this critically endangered species, a few specimens have been transferred to the Jawaharlal Nehru Tropical Botanic Garden and Research Institute located at Thiruvananthapuram. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2017 prelims paper. Which of the following is or are tributaries of the Brahmaputra? Dibang, Kameng, Lohit. All the three are correct. All these three rivers, they form the tributaries of the Brahmaputra. Option D is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, fighting fake news by using sedition law can lead to suppression of freedom of expression and freedom of press. Evaluate. The second question, the proposed amendments to the Electricity Act will only burden states and erode the concurrent status given to electricity. Critically examine. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.